Surprised we haven't had endorsement deals yet. Who hasn't reached out?
That's the influencers.
There's my voice.
Gotta know not to talk when she.
We can start the meeting now.
Okay, this is the Wood Village Urban Renewal meeting on March 2nd. Just kind of a conversation about the past and the future of the age. There is a Wood Village land acknowledgement statement. Would somebody like to read that for me? Or can we just acknowledge the statement at this point in time?
Based on the faces, I think
Okay, good.
acknowledging it.
Yes. And then it looks like we want to do a pledge of allegiance. According to the agenda. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. Okay, I guess goes back to Greg, URA 101.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. So as I talked a little bit before the meeting, this is really a sit down to talk about what urban renewal is, what the city's take on that is, some things that we've done, and what the future may hold, including a 5-year financial projection. This was suggested to us by some board members that have been around for a little while, about a year ago, saying, you know, there's been some new and newer members on the council, which the entire council forms the board, and then there's a minimum of 3 citizen members also on the board. And so it was thought of the last several years, there's been a lot of joint projects with the city. And it's important to note that urban renewal is its own distinct agency, but there is a lot of overlap, and it can be a little bit confusing of, you know, if council has an initiative, but it falls kind of under an urban renewal umbrella, there's a lot of blending. And it was thought, let's just take a moment now that there are no projects really in the works, or, you know, projects have wrapped up, take a step back and what is urban renewal and what is urban renewal for us? So that's what we hope to do tonight. And it's intended to be very conversational as I bring up things. I'm going to keep it fairly high level. There's a lot of detail, minutia. I will point out where that exists, but I won't talk about the detail, just to keep it very, you know, high level base knowledge, knowing that if and when we get in those specific situations, we bring up those details at that time, if it's applicable. So with that, I'm going to share the screen here. And you can't have a good meeting without a PowerPoint. All right, so talking about urban renewal. So again, we're going to do a little bit of urban renewal 101, as I'm calling it. It's probably more like a urban renewal 65. It's probably not even 100 level yet. Some stuff for Wood Village, our completed projects. Because we have some outstanding bond money that we need to actually spend and invest, there's a few handful of projects that we want to talk to you about and see which one or ones kind of spark your interest, or if there's something else that could be bond eligible that you'd want to have us explore so we can spend the rest of that bond money. And then we'll turn over to Seth for his 5-year financial projection. So your staff report outlined, you know, a fairly summary of what urban renewal is. And basically, in its purest form, is to revitalize and improve an area. Whether, you know, and part of that is declaring an area blight. And I'm using quotes of blight because that doesn't necessarily make it true blight that we may think of. It could just be that it's an underperforming economic area. It could be maybe there are some actual blighted structures and unsafe structures, or it's just simply under or undeveloped, and there's some limitations or constraints in getting that area to perform. Now, urban renewal can use a wide variety of financing options. A very popular one, the one that we use, is called tax increment financing. And I'll get to that in a future slide of the details of what that is and what that means for Wood Village. And then Seth will even get into more details of what it means for Wood Village. And the important thing to know is that urban renewal agencies must operate out of debt. So unlike the city's finances, where we must operate out of revenues, urban renewal agencies to collect any revenues need to be in debt. So it's a little bit of a different mindset compared to what we may think of in terms of other government or governance structures. We have to have debt to collect our revenues to then spend or invest those dollars. There's a physical size limit of urban renewal agency areas of 25% of those boundaries. For Wood Village, we're about at that 25%. And that's where you can see, like a city the size of Portland, 25%, that's why they have so many different agencies and districts, because geographically they're so large. For Wood Village being 1 square mile, when you see the map, that's why it is 25%. I think it's about 23, because of just our smaller geographical size. And now I also want to point out that urban renewal can be and has been quite controversial. I would say both, regionally and nationwide. Typically, as we saw kind of 60s, 70s, and 80s, urban renewal used to essentially decimate communities, often poorer communities, to put in freeways or to support private sector, for-profit development that never fully materialized. And what it did, it removed people, dislocated people, destroyed entire communities. And so there's been a number of laws over the decades to kind of rein those back in, but there still can be some abuses or just less optimal spending of that resource, say on giant cutlery. That was a dig for those who know.
Yeah, got it.
We haven't spent on giant cutlery. And that's not to say that, art actually is part of our plan. I'll talk about a plan shortly. So there is that, intrinsic value of art and creating community. But I just can't help but, put a fork in it. So again, we must operate out of debt. So tax increment financing, when an agency is formed, the boundaries, that tax base, the assessed value tax base is frozen in time. And I'm just going to use some round numbers. Say the area was valued at $30 million. So that $30 million is set, and that's a base. So over time, whether because of market factors or ideally because of, reinvestment and new development, as that grows, urban renewal gets 100% tax value of that growth. So let's just say it was at $30 million, and after a couple of years, it's $40 million. Urban renewal gets to collect the entire overlapping tax rate, which is a much larger amount than, say, like a city's tax rate or a school's tax rate, off that additional $10 million. All the other agencies collect still off the original 30. Agency gets all the growth up until it hits its max indebtedness. And then that value then gets returned back to all the underlying taxing jurisdictions, with the theory being that if urban renewal didn't exist, this area would continue to underperform or be underutilized. And so its tax growth would be very slow. But because of urban renewal and quality and the right kind of investments, it grew more than it would have otherwise. Thus, the short-term loss of those revenues for the jurisdictions is made up for in the long term by the additional growth. Just want to pause there and make sure that we're tracking that.
And so that's why like the city is able to incentivize like developers to say, because of the of us freezing that at that moment, then they can also receive X, Y.
Like that, for example, I'll just use the byway as an example. So there was a lot that went in that, but let's just say the city didn't own the land, that this was just a developer going into underutilized 5 acres. Because we said we'll help with that development, they upscaled a lot of things and increased its value. That increase in value then benefits everybody long-term. And I'll get into how our agency deals with development incentives specifically, because it's tied to actual return value, which is a nice piece for our program. And each agency around, state, nation, they set their own programs, and they could give away, here's just, X amount for this development. Ours is tied to estimated actual return. So when an agency basically, it ends, it's kind of in a 2-step process, because we have to operate out of debt. Once you know where your revenue trends are, you can fairly accurately project when you would collected your max indebted amount. Ours is just over $11 million, and I talk about that in a little bit. So when we know based on, new development and existing development, when we're going to hit that, we could say, great, we can take out, another loan bond to complete the rest of the projects. So let's just say we take out a $5 million loan or bond, we do some projects. Because now we would have spent our amount, there's no more projects for the agency to do. So it functionally ends. It still exists until then the debt is paid off. And then once the debt is paid off, that's when it actually does fully conclude its life, and the returns go back to the underlying taxing jurisdictions. Now, this is one where I'll say there are other considerations in that. This is not just as simple as I've spent $1, that dollar goes away from the indebtedness. There's some exemptions. For example, say we were to buy a chunk of property for $1 million, make it development ready and sell it, I'll just say for $1 million. The first $1 million comes off of our indebtedness, but when we sell it and get that $1 million back, you can just spend that $1 million again without counting towards your max indebtedness because you've already spent it once. Again, that doesn't come up often, and there's some other, admin things and loan things to consider. But again, in general, you spend $1, it goes off your max indebtedness. That's the important overlying thing to think about. And our agency's debt limit is $11,750,000. Speaking of our agency, here it is. Everything in green is in the urban renewal boundaries, and that is where it's easiest and cleanest to do a project. And by that, I mean, let's just say, one of our things in the plan is replacing the sewer trunk line. Well, you couldn't do the whole value of that replacement out of urban renewal funds. But if you know that because of redevelopment in some of these areas will increase the amount of sewer, you can proportionately spend that towards the sewer project, for example. So just because there may be some things outside the boundaries, but benefit the boundary itself, you can spend a proportionate amount. But generally it's cleanest when it's in the boundaries. And this boundary was modified in 2019 for this little section right there. And if anyone wondering, that's where our city hall is. Mayor, did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Okay. Didn't know if I heard something on the speaker. So urban renewal for us.
It may have been the dog. I don't know.
So ours was formed in 2010 after a couple of years of a lot of work and consultants formulating a plan, the declaration of blight, what we're going to do, the max indebtedness. And we did that update in 2019. The 2019 update did more than just update the map. It actually updated all the project list. And that was attached in your staff report. And we'll hit the high notes of that in another couple slides. As I said, our max indebtedness is $11,750,000. And that was based on consultants' view of what actually could be redeveloped and what that value will be in a period of time, usually about a 20-year period, what could be redeveloped and what could be captured based off that redevelopment. So you'll see that each agency itself has different debt limits. Ours is based on what it was presumed to bring in, and as Seth will talk about, I mean, it was a pretty good estimate, really. So it was about the right amount. Now, the Urban Renewal Board itself has said we're not going to use eminent domain to capture properties, basically use raw power to condemn properties to assemble and redevelop. You have said we will only acquire properties from willing sellers. Now that may not be the properties on the market per se, but you could say we want to see if they'd be willing to sell it. But you're not going to go in and use eminent domain to take it. And now there's also been some statutory limitations on that, because it used to be urban renewal agencies would essentially use their power of eminent domain to take a bunch of parcels, assemble them, and then just turn around to a developer. The state says you can't do that anymore. You can if it's a willing seller, but you can't use eminent domain to do that. You do have one established program, and that's our redevelopment assistance program. And the important thing to note with this one too, it's discretionary. So if a developer comes in and says, I'm building X, or I want to build X, they have to come before you all as the board to do their proposal and why your assistance would benefit the project and community at large. So unlike other jurisdictions or agencies, a lot of them is you get X amount for this type of development or this amount for that type of development. You say, you developer, you need to prove to us that it's worth the investment. And there's been a couple of developments that received little or no incentive from you all because the development would have happened with or without your assistance. And that's a key part of this, is you want to help incentivize and grow something that wouldn't otherwise be there, but for urban renewal. And that benefit is capped at up to 25% of the estimated returns back to the agency. So when you use easy numbers here, let's just say development would return $1 million to the agency over the remaining life of the agency. The developer could then get up to $250,000 towards that project, usually in the form of SDC credits, building permits, that type of thing. Those are very easy ones to do. The agency is in debt, which is a good thing, as we learned, since we have to be. There's been a general fund loan, and that's what kept the agency going for, gosh, 9 years until we took out a bond. And we did a bond issuance in 2019 for about $3.3 million, and that helped pay back some of the general fund. Well, we actually didn't use it to pay back the general fund loans. We still kept that payment going. But the byway redevelopment package, no, yeah, the SDCs on that one was the Errata Road fence, and that's where we still have, oh, and then the Halsey crossings. But we still have that 150,000 about because the crosswalks aren't finished yet. So we haven't got that final bill, but it's roughly 150,000 of that bond remaining that we need to spend on an eligible project because the bond covenants say that you have to spend all that money by a certain date. Now, we've hit all the other milestones of getting, 60% of it spent, 80% of it spent. But what you can't do, it's called arbitrage, where basically you're holding bond monies and basically collecting more interest on the bond monies than you're paying in interest and actually earning money off the bond. You can't do that.
I was gonna ask that question. Because, but one time I think that
Well, and that's kind of where, yeah, when the general fund loaned it to, we've actually done that a lot where the general funds either loaned it to urban renewal, SDC funds, or like the street fund at an interest rate that was a very fair interest rate, but more than we were getting from our state pool interest rate. But yeah, you can't hold bond monies and then start collecting interest. You can collect some interest revenue off of that, but not a lot of interest revenue. So we've got about 150 in an eligible that we need to spend on an eligible project, which means it has to meet the bond covenants and essentially in the agency, in the plan, and that we retain ownership of at the end. Those are the three main buckets to hit. And we have some ideas that we'll talk about at the end, but certainly if you have other thoughts or ideas, we can talk about that then too. So in general, there's about 7-ish million left in remaining funds before we hit that max indebtedness. And that's because now that we've got Riverwood South, the byway, and Seth will talk about, we'll start to see revenues really start peaking. So it may sound odd to think we spent, the first 13 years of the agency just getting at, $4 or $5 million. How in the next 10 can we get to 7? Well, Seth will show you that later. But basically our revenue collection will increase dramatically. Now we have to pay back this $3.3 million bond. So the next few years, there's not a lot of room there for things. But after that bond's paid off, there's a lot of growth to then wrap up any, projects that you all want to take on. And there are no major development projects in the works that we're aware of. There are some things that had been in the pipeline that fell apart. So as we know it right now, there's nothing big coming in within the agency boundaries. But even without that, and again, Seth will talk about it in a bit, the agency will hit, the debt limit. We'll get enough revenue to that debt limit in about 2033. Well, we will pay off the last of the bonds in 2033, 2034, give or take, is when we can actually estimate closing the agency because we would have paid off the rest of that $7 million loan. So don't think that just because there's not a development in the works doesn't mean that we can't take on more projects. It'll just be a few years before we can have that breathing room again. So here's what's in your plan. And in your packet, it actually detailed out what's under those amounts. So like infrastructure, for example, there's a couple big ones. The really big one is supporting Main Streets on Halsey and doing a lot of things to redevelop Halsey Street. That's at $2 million. We thought we may be undergrounding lines on Halsey, and as we researched that, that's probably not going to happen. That was the other big piece of that. And then any kind of infrastructure tied to development. I think that was just me echoing. For redevelopment assistance, that's actually what was included in the portion of this building, the 1.6 million. And then where we do development incentives is under that economic development assistance program. Everything else is relatively minor dollars in the plan that you'll see, toolkits or gateway signs, some of the art, and those are smaller values compared to other things. I want to pause right here to see, are there any questions or thoughts about anything in the plan? It's relatively broad and, it may have kind of, city gateway signs and statues. There's a lot of ways to broaden that, or again, supporting Main Streets on Halsey. There's a lot of breadth in that. So just because it may sound somewhat specific, how we tie it to that can vary.
Around the economic development assistant, kind of what has been in place? Kind of what has that?
That's that 25% program.
Okay.
So when a developer comes in and says, agency, I want some help, that's where that money comes from, out of that bucket.
And that's usually just to cover like permits.
STCs and permits. And again, the larger the project, the larger the amount, relatively smaller project. Actually, why don't I just get to our past projects? Because we have a range here. So our very first project was a business incentive program for 2010. As you remember, that was a booming year. Going through a recession, not the best time to start an urban renewal agency. As a member Dirks remembers, there was a lot of nothing.
Yeah, there was a whole lot of, yeah.
But we did spin up a business incentive program for businesses locating in the agency in vacant storefronts to just start revitalizing the area, get interest in it again. And that all in was only about $12,000. And that was building permit costs and the first year of the business license. We then went in, so Riverwood South, that's where you live. So that's the 44 units just south of the original Riverwood development. The only reason Urban Renewal got involved in there is because that was going to be built whether Urban Renewal was going to be involved or not. And so Urban Renewal said, we're kind of out. But what happened was the storm system that had been put in place in Riverwood North was designed and built out actually for how it looks today. But because so much time had elapsed and Riverwood's, phase 2 hadn't been built, that was owned and controlled by Riverwood North and its HOA. And so if they didn't get HOA approval to use it, Riverwood South would have 2 fewer homes because they'd have to build their own retention detention pond for stormwater. So they just said, well, 2 more homes on the tax rolls, that's something, maybe we can help with that, because what Riverwood North wanted was a chain link fence. I think we can cover that. And it was about $12,000 between clearing the area and hiring someone to put in a fence, which then allowed 2 more homes to be built and the full utilization of a facility that had been built to manage that. So that's where Urban Renewal got involved and said, okay, well, if we don't get involved, there'll be 2 less homes. It's worth, a minimal investment. And we got that through. The Errata Road fence, that was long on the books, but we wanted to wait till county was done with the multi-year project. And when they were, we came right in thanks to, John's work. And I mean, it really sprucened up that whole area, especially given if you think of Errata Road prior to the expansion project and the fencing project, how it looked and felt, how it looks and feels today with all the fencing, it's gorgeous. And again, benefits, the community at large. And that was, I think, just under 400,000.
100,000.
The byway, I think we're all familiar with the byway. Now, some of us may not be familiar with the years and years and years of work that went into, prepping the land for sale, putting it on the market, working with developers and crafting these agreements. It was a fairly large agreement and it covered utility relocation. So since the city had owned that since forever, by forever, I mean, since the city existed, when utilities needed to go through it, it was, shortest distance, point A to point B. There was no thought of, utility corridors and laying it out. So to maximize the land, a lot of utilities had to be relocated to fit a more optimal layout. So we covered the cost of that. We covered the cost of some SDCs, and that was about it. And it was right around $1 million, I think just under 800,000, 900,000. Yeah. for the total incentive. And why the dollar number I can't get specific was because of how our agreement is, it's up to 25% of the estimated returns. That was a multi-year project. And as it was getting kind of phased in and built out with the assessor, it was a little hard to project, but at some point you need to kind of close out. Here's where we think it will come in. Here's the final payment. Because what we did, we front loaded it about 2/3, stopped and said, as you get closer to finishing the project to make sure they actually finished it, then we'll true up, close it out, and then, you'll wrap up your project. And we ended up, they were down to the last 2 buildings, I think, when we trued it up. So they already had, the commercial was done, most of the residential was done and being occupied. So we really wanted to protect, again, it may, it's still the public's dollar that we're stewards of. And we want to make sure that if we're going to invest in your $1 million, it was, secure. For City Hall, we did the 1.65 million contributing to this building, which I think was worth it. And now you'll see, nearly wrapped up with the crosswalks. Probably would have been wrapped up, but for some nice spring weather. So what we're waiting on is, the paint and thermoplastic markings. They need to be certain temperatures to do that. So the contractor will warranty them. And we figured we can wait a month to get a warranty on those items. So you can see they're mostly built, just waiting for that last piece. Probably going to come in a total project cost of just, $650.
Yeah, including design. Yeah.
It's hard. We haven't got the design costs from the county yet, so that's kind of the unknown one. But again, a project that benefits Halsey, benefits the boundaries of the agency, and benefits the community at large.
Yeah, question. Did we still have that grant money? Yeah.
Yes, the $100,000 ODOT grant money is contributing to the project.
The total cost was
That's probably going to be $650.
Yeah, right in that. ballpark.
including the grant money.
Yeah, that's just total cost. And then
Okay.
so grant money will take $100,000 off
Okay.
that. And then we've got the urban renewal dollars. Now, we actually had a second development assistance agreement in place a few years ago. Probably remember for Vista View, that was the vacant property at 240th right here. It went through design review, got approvals, it then came to you all as a board. It was a very high-end development. You said, yeah, we will support that one. Developer, even with the incentive, couldn't close out the financing of the deal, and ultimately it was actually foreclosed upon. But because you hadn't put any dollars in it, we were out the staff time crafting the development agreement. There's no hard dollar spent doing even the property or anything like that, which again is a smart approach. Other agencies start putting in dollars right away to get a project to go that may or may not ever come to fruition. That's not how this agency operates. So again, you may hear in the news about this redevelopment agency or this agency, spending X dollars and a project fall apart. We don't spend dollars really upfront until a project's baked and building. There was a purchase agreement in place. But again, as we went through due diligence and working through an agreement, couldn't get to terms. So we backed out, and, minimal money was spent on some of the due diligence and things. But just, it didn't feel right. So again, we pulled it because again, looking after the public's dollars. So now we get into some potential projects for that 150,000. And the first one is the gateway sign redesign and build. And it's not because our current sign isn't beautiful. It's because you'll see in this other picture, it's falling apart, and it's falling apart again. These were rebuilt, I want to say about 8 to 10 years ago. And it just keeps they're natural logs. It's a great look. It's also not one that's easy to maintain, and certainly not easy to repair being in 238th median. So the idea is we get a redesign. These are simply just concepts I pulled off the internet. Don't worry, we would get a design that meets the aesthetics of the community, probably go through Parks Commission and whatnot. But thinking about something that's not going to rot away at the base, but still retains, wood, maybe some steel, stone, things that are incorporating our look and feel. So I just use these as just kind of examples. And again, it's not because we don't love this, but could we do something a little bit newer, modern, incorporate our banners without blocking our sign, those types of things. Other project is the park restroom actually here up front. Oh, come on. So with our current restroom, it's actually getting upon 20 years old. It still seems relatively new to me, but it's about almost 20 years old. And even in the Parks Master Plan acknowledges some amount of either reinvestment or replacement to it. And why we kind of thought replacement is just kind of in the 20 years since it's been in there, how restrooms have adapted and changed over that time. And instead of, there's a men's side and a women's side and just a couple of stalls, this individual, kind of room is becoming more and more popular, whether it's because the parent can let their child go in and know their child's going to be taken care of, or maybe the child needs help and a parent doesn't have to worry about which restroom do as a parent go in if it's, crossing some areas there. Now, that's not to say that this design also doesn't come with inherent concerns or things to think about, such as maybe someone camps out in there, maybe someone's doing some less than ideal activities in there. There are things to do that can mitigate that, and we don't want to get in those details yet, because it would, if, urban renewal, parks and council say, you know what, let's look at replacing it with something like this style, we'll explore those options to best mitigate the potential negative externalities that that then we can get all the positives out of it. And again, I wouldn't advocate for just a plain cinder block thing. That's why I kind of included this, it'd still meet the aesthetics of the park and city hall and blend in well to the built environment. We also think we could probably get more stalls. So total, the restroom can serve 6 individuals. We think we might be able to get 8 out of it and get a little more excess capacity. The other thing is too, now that the restrooms are 24/7 all year round, winter usage is a lot less than peak summer usage. So we could, close off a number of the restrooms, leaving 1 or 2 open during the winter months, having less maintenance, less wear and tear, versus then the summer having it open all year round. Versus now, if it's open, everything's open. Last but not least, kind of a fun, lower cost one that really, whatever project you want to fit in, we can probably fit this in. Garbage cans on Halsey. There are a number of places on Halsey. No places on Halsey have a garbage can to use. And when City Hall was on the corner of 238th, we actually had a garbage can that we maintained. And it really kept down on the litter. And if you look at where, the convenience stores, the restaurants, high-use bus stops are, there's a lot of litter. And we end up picking it up because that's the service expectation we have for our community. These are called big belly trash cans, and they're amazing because they're self-contained solar compacting garbage cans that basically get you about 8 times more capacity than a standard 55-gallon garbage can. Because it'll know when it's getting full, compact it down. Know it's getting full, compact it down. The other cool thing it does, I'm 80% full. You might want to think about, emptying me. It sends you an email saying I'm getting full. So we don't have to drive around, every day or multiple times thinking, is it full? Is it full? Is it full? The other really cool feature that because it is compacting, there's some safety concerns. So you see, it's not just open for people to reach into. It's a little door and kind of a bucket that you put in and disposes of it. What that does is, we've got raccoons, we've got critters and things that may want to eat the garbage. They can't. Also, if someone for whatever reason wants to dump garbage out because that seems like a fun idea, they can't. And lastly, as you can see on this side, we wouldn't do a recycling one because it did probably too much cross contamination. I picked this because it shows you can then wrap them. Basically, we can celebrate the Halsey brand. We can celebrate the Wood Village brand and really start promoting, Halsey as a gateway, as a network, as a destination with it. These run about $5,000 a piece, and 4 to 5 of them is probably what would really serve Halsey well. You can do a little more, a little less. And so really, between either of these 2 projects, you could fit that into it pretty easily. Guessing on, cost for a new gateway sign, we were ballparking design at 30 to 40,000. It's really hard to tell. We just did a bid opening today that had a biggest bid spread we've ever seen. But we think, reasonably a design of, it's fairly simplistic, 30 to 40,000 is we think is a good number. And then, the bill just kind of depends on how much for how much, but certainly could fit well within that 150. Again, the restroom, urban renewal wouldn't pay for the entire restroom replacement, just a portion of it. Because the idea would be we're looking at potentially using a bit of ARPA funds. Because we think that could be eligible and again, benefits the community at large, a bit of general fund funds, and then urban renewal. So trying to get a couple of buckets at this, which again, if you were to ask how much it costs, it's in the six figures, but is it 250? Is it 400? We honestly don't know yet. And I think we would want to get some more design, what do we want it to be? What are the features and functions? And then we can get some ballpark estimates. But I think it's safe to say, consider 400, maybe even 5, just to be on the safe side. And so urban renewal could help a portion of that. And then again, if you like the idea, again, garbage cans, they're not just, 5,000 for a garbage can kind of raises some eyebrows. The standard ones we have in our park are already over 1,000. So when you think of the features you're getting, incrementally, that's not a bad value.
Would you guys only want to consider doing that on Halsey, or were there be?
Because of the urban renewal boundaries, it fits cleanest and easiest on Halsey. Now, there's a bit here on Errata that we can look at. You could probably make an argument for a bit of Wood Village Boulevard, but I think for Wood Village Boulevard, it probably makes more sense here since we're getting some new restaurants and things. But certainly there's some portion of Errata that we could look at too, maybe the corners here or, some key corners or intersection. That's why I said, 5 plus or minus can really spread some out at some couple bus stops and, maybe some spots along Errata.
Greg, I'm having trouble hearing, maybe it's because if you don't speak directly into the mic, does that when I can't hear? Is that how it works?
I thought I was talking into it. So.
Oh, no, I've been hearing, I can hear you. It's just when others say a question or something, I'm not always able to hear it. So
we'll put the mics in front of their face closer.
Yeah. The question I have I got a question on both of these, but on the big belly.
Yeah.
2 things. We could wrap those at various times with various messages, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So we could seasonalize it, or if we, whatever. What's the theft on these? Are these something that somebody can carry off, or do you anchor them in some fashion?
They are anchored. They're GPS located. So if someone wants to take it, we can find it. They also have dropped them from a crane and have a sledgehammer contest on beating on the solar panel. So they're pretty much one of the most durable garbage cans you will find.
All right. And that was my other question, the solar panels. So those will hand up. So they're built to be
They're built for urban environments. One of the questions I asked the rep is, so someone takes it into the scrapyard. They said, yeah, you can find what scrapyard it's in.
Yeah. Okay.
So good.
All right.
Get our garbage can back.
Go back to, if you would, for a minute, the signs. I'm a guy that remodels everything. And as I'm looking at that, the sign, with the exception of where that post goes into the ground, is pretty solid, correct?
All the support posts are rotting out.
Yeah.
So the upper frame, I think is reasonable, but it's not easily serviceable. So if, for example, there start to become issues, it's hard versus we were thinking if you use, stones and steel with decorative wood, when that wood starts to deteriorate, you're just replacing decorative pieces. You don't need to necessarily block multiple lanes of 238th and get a crane and much like what we have to do now.
Your design over there on the right-hand side where the stone is, basically that's what you'd have to do to this sign to make it not at every 8 or 10 year replacement project. Is that?
Hopefully, because in the last refurbishment, so the post used to be just in the dirt. In the last refurbishment about a decade ago, they removed the sign entirely, poured. You can kind of see at the very bottom there, these concrete footings. Unfortunately, it's still natural raw timber. And so we thought using stone and steel as the frame would give it essentially a 50-year life, or just doing touch-ups more or less is the thought. And again, these are just ideas to, start percolating. It is not a design. It's very clear.
Yeah.
It's the best Google had to offer.
That's
Well,
pretty
way
good
to go.
anyways.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah. The key issue on the new signs is it has to be off the ground. You got to have some kind of concrete, more solid feature to mount that sign. So
That's what we were thinking. And again, we've got the stone on the islands now. We've got
Sure.
stone here at the city hall. I can, match that style, that feel.
And
Yeah.
then it fits with the Main Streets on Halsey,
I think
more or less,
Well,
yeah.
if it's our views of Main Street on
Yeah,
Halsey.
yeah, again, if it's our section of the Main Streets on Halsey.
Yes,
So,
and the thought behind this too is, we have the other one to the south on 238. That's actually in better condition than this one.
Hmm.
And so, but you can use the same design. So Urban Renewal pays for one design and rebuilds this one, and then we can use other funds to actually build out the other side.
Yeah.
So
Garbage, yeah.
thoughts on the project, something resonate, not resonate, love, hate, other ideas?
I like the restroom piece. I think that's huge, just because again, we're investing in the future and kind of that future's kind of here and now. This is just it looks like it fits in because so that wetland park over there, is there going to be any thoughts of restrooms over there as well, or not?
It's very constrained because it's Army Corps and state lands. There's only a very small portion that you can actually build something on. And we've got that designated more for like picnicking area, and to run utilities to that.
Maybe you can.
It's not impossible, but you are paying for it
Yeah.
to try to get a restroom facility there. So this is planned as kind of being, the restroom facility for our city, which the other cities don't have either.
And I wanted to ask a question about those restrooms too. On all three projects, they're all important. The restroom, if you're at 5 or 6, 600, where would we, 100, 150 will get you started, very start, design and maybe a little work, but how would we supplement that so we have the money to move forward on that? Where would that money come from? Would it have to come from the general fund or any ideas?
That would be a discussion with the city council, which I know I'm talking to members of the city council. The short answer is general fund. There's also, we've been looking at the ARPA funds, which we have about 800,000 remaining. The original idea was split that up between water and sewer and take on a project. We'll see in the next several months when the master plans come back, there's not a lot in water. There's very big projects in sewer. But that project in sewer, probably because of the infrastructure acts that are being, were passed by the federal, there's probably some pretty unique opportunities to get lower, no cost money for that. And so the thought is maybe we carve off a portion of ARPA, a portion of general fund. And if you're all willing, then a portion of urban renewal and get this accomplished kind of in that sense.
On the restroom, what's your timeline like? Next year, year after that, 2 years, 3 years?
Well, if we want to spend ARPA money on it, it would be 25, 26.
That we have to spend it by.
On the urban renewal money.
Just on
Urban renewal
on the ARPA money.
next.
Urban renewal, we have, I believe it's 5 years from when we issued the bonds, and we issued those in May of 2025. So it'd be we issued them in May of 2020. So
Okay,
it'd be May of 2025 is when everything has to be spent.
okay.
So we got about like 2 years.
Couple years kind of
Couple years.
on both.
Well, I would think that maybe the council will make that a priority as far as a project, It's going to be up to the council to make that spending decision. If we got to spend that urban renewal money in that time frame, you should probably get moving on that is my suggestion.
And we talked at the last council meeting a little bit about the winterization of current restrooms, and we've had to do another ad for some plumbing, which is a good enough solution, but not a long-term solution.
It buys some time, so it wasn't designed for that. And then what we found out, because it's near 20 years old, a lot of things were actually obsolete. So it wasn't just, oh, repair this piece of copper. It was, you've got valves that no longer work and aren't available. So it was quite the project just to get them functional again. And I don't know if, John, you want to.
No, exactly. It was, they weren't designed for winter use. And now the use has changed from really 6 months to now 365 days a year. So
Right. Okay.
And in the summer, just completely, you know,
The park is getting used. I mean, between, you know,
Yeah.
Play East Recreation, this building being here at the splash pad, the investments that have been made over the past couple of years, it's started to become very well known and very well loved. We've also heard from some folks that, well, expectations for public restrooms are kind of down here. We're not down here in terms of an agency. We want things up here. And so it's either a very large reinvestment into the current ones that have their issues, or it's looking at a full-on replacement.
There's a couple of thoughts listening to the conversation here and previous conversations on these is one, we have to do something with these restrooms at some point. They're costing us money. They're costing staff time. And I believe it's really a feature of these part of our park. And any of these projects, this will serve our residents better and in a more direct way than the other projects. Now, the other projects, I have a thought or two on those too, but I really think if we could have a plan, my thought is if we had a plan on how we could actually launch this project with using the 150 and lined out that we had an idea how that could work, I'd like to hear that. The garbage cans, as you say, they're $5,000 a piece or so. Maybe we can find a way to do that, or the signs. But if we're going to have to rely, I'd rather try to get some information on the restrooms. And then if we have to go to the general fund to do some sign work, that looks a little different. So anyway, those are my thoughts on this right now. This one, to me, more directly serves our residents.
yeah, I agree. If we're gonna, if out of those three projects, we're prioritizing, you know, I think restroom is kind of the focus, with the sign coming next, and then, you know.
So would it be a fair, accurate statement to say, as we're having now discussions that we'll have with council, to say, you know, Parks Commission has said restrooms a priority, Urban Renewal has said they're willing to put some support behind the funding of it. Is that a fair? Again, not having all the details, all the costs and all the features, but just Urban Renewal's interested in it. Is that?
That's fair. Yeah.
That's fair.
That's fair.
Could we
Works for
go,
me.
could we go back to the urban renewal area map you had? So can I give maybe a little history on why we have some of this in here? As you can see, when we drew this up, starting back in the early.
08, I think. Oh,
Yeah,
08, 09.
before we start thinking about this was the old Greyhound track,
Yeah.
talking about redevelopment into, and, you know, an extension of a town center, but entertainment based. And then, you know, the Grand Round bought the property, and now it's sitting, for all intents and purposes, may sit for another 20 years or something. So I don't think that's even viable from a,
And
to a certain
that's
extent.
where, when you look at all the projections, all the budgets from the last, you know, 13 years, we've never assumed any specific development at that site, because either it was going to be a very large, whether it was a private casino or, you know, with now the Grand Ron's entertainment complex, with those were hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Our agency wasn't really designed with that in mind.
Yeah, I want to add to that we had, our eyes were much bigger than our stomach was, you know, we put this together because we're thinking about redeveloping that. but also this other area here, which is Wood Village Greens. Okay,
Yeah, you've got Widow's Green and actually Poplar.
we were thinking about if, at that point, the mindset was if somebody was to come in and want to buy that property and redevelop it, we would work with them to make sure, if they're willing to work with us, that they built like affordable housing on there. You know, we had like cottage housing in the plan, townhouses and stuff like that. But over the years, we found that manufactured home parks are like a goose that lays the golden egg month in and month out, and they can determine the size of that egg.
We've actually gone into trying to protect them and have tenants that rent spaces be the owners now. We
Right,
kind of
right.
360, 180 that one.
And so anyway, I'm saying those two areas I think are totally off.
Yeah.
Can I,
Maybe 20.
You think so?
It still has to go through the federal.
The feds and the state,
I didn't
And the
realize
state.
it was that long.
probably
Well, ALMA, how many years did that take?
over 20.
But they're patient and they'll probably stick with it.
And that's the thing,
Maybe.
that's the thing to remember. They are patient. It's the long game on that one. In terms of, our agency, the next 10 years, maybe it's built, maybe it's not. But it's not in any financial projections. It's not in any of our plans. It existed as the blight because it was. I mean, it was an abandoned Greyhound park.
Right, it was blight.
It's basically a placeholder right now, just in case, per se. I mean,
On the flip side, say a $500 million thing went in there, they return to the agency, we'd be
Oh,
done in
yeah.
a year.
That was kind of the idea. That was going to be a golden ticket for the agency, and it's not going to happen. So I'm kind of like the idea that we kind of not look to doing anything really big going forward with the agency, just because doing something really big is difficult on our staff, because we do hire the staff to do all this work for us. And there's a lot of nuances that we aren't getting into as far as urban renewal. It goes way over my head when we get into all the financing and such.
Well, we have a financial advisor and bond counsel to help us too. So
Oh, yeah.
don't feel bad.
Yeah, exactly. But I would personally, from being involved this basically from the beginning, is just maybe look at sunsetting it and do these smaller projects and not move into some big project, because,
These are small.
oh yeah, like ones we're talking about,
Yeah.
like.
Oh, yeah, those are nice projects.
Those are
Those
nice
are
projects.
great.
One of the best projects I think we did was the crosswalks, actually.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
didn't put it in here because it could be a little intriguing. We know there's more crosswalks needed on Wood Village Boulevard. Again, we could look at how we can maybe fit that in too. Not for the short term with this current 150, but for that next tranche of money in a few years, and maybe we know a little bit more about the timeline of the Grand Ron and how we can integrate a crossing in the short term that we don't have to knock down in a few years for their
Oh,
thing.
exactly.
And where another one's desperately needed is not in the agency at all. So again, not saying that because there's not crosswalks there, we're ignoring it. It's just the timing's not quite
Yeah.
right. But yeah, love the crosswalks. I mean, that's
Yeah.
urban renewal at its best.
Oh, absolutely.
well, Greg, you just stole what I wanted to say about the next crosswalks is right there. And I wanted to at least get that in the record here in our conversation. So you did that for me, that we need a crosswalk on Wood Village Boulevard. And that needs to be an ongoing conversations. And, small city grants committee that I'm on, we're working with, we should be ready to go right back at a grant, whether they think it's one they can approve or not. Because I think we have to keep working on that. They're about $250K a piece, it appears. So,
Yeah, two and change.
yeah. So
We'll-
I'm
we'll
glad
find out.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want us to keep talking about that at the council. Because that is a direct safety issue for our residents. So,
And, I just want to again bring up, we did talk about, Poplar, Wood Village Green, they're safe, they're protected. We're not going to go and dislocate those communities. Just again, since we talked about it, but I just want to reiterate because urban renewal could be used for that. That's not how, this board has wanted to operate. And just again, on record for all those watching, it's not people who live there, no people live there don't have to have any worries.
Where are we on? We've done the project.
We're on the
recap,
5-year
apparently.
financial projection.
Have we done the
Ready.
5-year? Oh, here's Seth. Okay.
Talk some dollars.
Okay, money man.
Not nearly as fun as restrooms or trash cans.
No, it isn't really.
What is though?
Thank you.
Greg let off with that and stole all the good stuff.
This is where I have a tendency to glaze over when we get into the money side, really.
I'm glad you said it.
Yeah.
I just gotta say that Greg was glowing talking about those trash cans, so.
Yes. Will we have a camera on them that we can like live stream? Yeah, on Zoom, yeah, on YouTube. Maybe a thought, okay.
After we finish building the city hall broadcast brand, we'll start to
Okay.
expand into. Chair, board, before you tonight, we're gonna go through a quick summation of the 5-year projection. Including your packet was, I think, a 5 or 6 page report with a lot of detail. I'm not going to cover all of that tonight unless you guys want to. I'm going to try and hit the high points. Greg did let me know that I'm gonna have to find a new comic in order to lead off these presentations with, because Dilbert is while still appropriate for this context, in some other context is no longer appropriate. So yes.
It's a good one to read. I've read for every comic.
So just this is kind of a little bit of a summary of the 5-year forecast that we gave to council. Generally, what we're projecting for the next year or two is that there will be a small contraction within the economy. And so we've built that into our financial projections. The state recently came out with an economic forecast, I think last week, that said they're no longer forecasting a recession, but it's the middle of a session, and I think they're probably being a little rose colored since it's time to spend money. I would bet on that recession happening regardless of what the state forecast. We're a little more pessimistic about how things are going to
I
go.
think it's called realistic, but
I make that point to my wife. I have not won. One of the biggest things is inflation, and that does impact urban renewal, because part of the cost is paying for staff and the materials and a portion of the materials and services that it takes to staff and fund, keep the lights on, doors open for the agency. It'll also impact a much larger impact when we actually get into projects and some of the construction inflation. But here's just kind of where things have been. Fortunately, we're thinking that inflation and CPI is kind of peaking. That's kind of the hope, is that things will at least start to flatten, if not to reverse the trend that we've seen over the last nearly 2 years. So how that impacts this forecast is we built in some inflation assumptions, 5% inflation for next year, 4% for the following year, and 3% kind of for the next. And that's kind of based on the survey that the Philadelphia Federal Reserve does of, they poll like 80 to 100 economists and say, what's your best guess? And that's the average of what the guesses were. So it's about as good as I can come up with. So that's what we use. Just to note, prolonged inflation would erode the operating margin, because as Greg mentioned, tax increment financing, we get the 3% growth every year, unless there's new development that kind of bumps that up. We just get the 3%. So if our costs are growing by 7 and we're getting 3, we're falling behind, and that's eating into our operating margin. So we're not projecting that, but that is a kind of a danger looking forward. This is what I have just said. We always put in some assumptions for development. This is the development assumptions that we have for the city. We do, currently in our 5-year forecast for the Urban Renewal Agency, we're not assuming any additional development within the Urban Renewal Agency boundaries. That's probably not likely. There's usually something like a remodel, a small remodel. There might be a single family home, a slot split, something like that over the next 5 years, but we're not wanting to put that in and count on that revenue. So we're just assuming, since we have no known projects of people who have got anything in the development pipeline, we're not going to put anything in. If we were contacted by someone who was looking to do a project and started having some traffic studies, engineering work, design done, then we would consider putting that in. But until that point, we're kind of taking the stance of, until you get kind of have a lot of money committed, we're not going to start spending that money. So I just wanted to put that, and that is a pretty big shift because over, with Riverwood South and the byway project, we have had a lot of growth over the last 3 to 4 years. We're not planning on maintaining that level of growth over the next few years. One thing I did want to talk about, we went over this with the council as part of our reorganization with staff that happened in July, kind of shifting of some duties, reclassification of some positions. We sat down and kind of we hadn't done this probably in 6 or 7 years. Sat down and took a hard look of where is everyone actually spending their time and how do we make sure that we're reflecting that within the cost. So what I'll highlight here is that Urban Renewal did get a little bit more staffing when we went through that allocation. And that makes sense that if 7 years ago, there wasn't a lot going on, weren't spending a lot of staff time over the last 3 or 4 years, this number is probably low, but we're kind of thinking that that might be what a new normal looks like. Is it's going to take, as new projects come up, as new ideas come up, it's going to take more staffing than it did during the first 5 to 7 years of the agency, where, like, I think, like Chair Dirk said, there wasn't a lot going on from 2000 to 2017, 2010 to 2017. So this does have an impact on urban renewal and will be incorporated in the budget for next year. This is a little excerpt from a property tax presentation. So new growth, when it comes on, gets assessed at, if the assessor's office has to come up with an assessed value. You have your real market value, you have an assessed value. If you have an existing property, your assessed value is capped at 3%, but how do you assess a property that has never been on the tax rolls? And so what they do is they have a black box that they put a bunch of numbers into and a number spits out at the end. It's supposed to be kind of a weighted average of similar properties within the area that they're looking at. With the byway, we got the property tax roll data in November of this last year and got our own an update on what that ratio was. So in 2022, the change property ratio for Wood Village multifamily was 47.8%. So that meant that if you spend $1 million on property, then you would have an assessed value of $487,000. From 2022 to 2023, that change property ratio dropped from 47.8% to 35.2%. It basically declined about a third. Which means that if you build $1 million property, instead of the tax base of 470,000, it's coming on at 350, which we get the rates on that kind of base. And so that basically cut our revenue on that property by about a third of what we expected. We met with the county to talk about why that happened. They gave us an answer. It was not an answer we liked, but it was an answer. Essentially, what they have done over the last 5 years is they have been increasing the real market value for all of the mobile home parks. Essentially, over the last 5 years, they've doubled it. So if a mobile home park was valued at $5 million in 2018, it's now valued at over 10 million in 2023. And so because that grew, and I think what I'll say about it is, I think that the values that they have now are accurate. I think for a large number of years, they weren't paying attention and weren't valuing it appropriately. So if you look back at the values, I think the northernmost one by Walmart sold
Mhm.
for like $11 million. In 2018, when that sold, the real market value was under 5 and it sold for 11. So I think they're accurate now. The problem is they weren't accurate all the years before that. The other issue that kind of surprised us is when they put the byway was partially done in 2022. It was as of kind of what was on the ground as of January 2022, which was January 1st, 2022, which was, I think, probably 5 or 6 of the
It was- it was
buildings and the
quite a bit.
commercial. It was most of the property. What they did was they took the full 100% of the market value and put that on as a placeholder. So that's why we didn't see the number gradually dropping, is because in 2021 and 2022, they were putting value from the byway on the tax roll at inflated rate, which according to them is how the assessor's handbook says they need to do it. But it's hard for us on the reporting end to really know what they're doing with that valuation. So this really kind of caught us by surprise. And so Greg and I sat down and met with them and talked through all of the issues and kind of the whys of what was happening, and presented this to council 3 months ago when we found out about it. But really, it doesn't impact the city, it impacts our renewal, because as you can see, we were anticipating to get about $320,000 a year from that. We're going to get about 230. So about $100,000 a year less, which is a substantial amount of money.
We've also connected with our state representatives to introduce legislation correcting the changed property ratio. Not going to go into the details of all that, but you can kind of see how it can really wonky some things up pretty quickly. And Seth came up with a really elegant solution that doesn't need a constitutional amendment. So we're really hopeful that while it won't help in this scenario, for in the future, for us, for others, could correct this deficiency.
And really the solution is getting the assessors out of the business of using their black box to spit numbers out. We'd like to just have one number. It
Elegant.
doesn't change. Trying to reduce the work for our friends in the assessor's office. What does this mean? So this was the projection that we showed you last year for expenses and revenue. And as you can see, we were going to have our revenues be a little bit higher than all of our operating expenses. Losing $100,000 basically meant that this blue line dropped $100,000 in 2023, 2022. And that, again, impacts us every year going forward. Kind of what that means for us is that we were thinking that we were going to have enough revenue in 2031, 32 to basically be done collecting revenue and put all of the development that happened back on the tax rolls so that the county and the state and the city general fund could start receiving that money back. This is going to delay that at least 2 years because we have to collect money until we hit that $11.75 million plus debt service to pay that all off. So when we sold the bonds in 2020, we communicated to you that this is really going to constrain what we can do in the short term. I think the message at the time was we have a little bit of operating margin to take some small projects on, but realistically over the 3 to 5 years that we're paying off the bonds and wrapping up the projects, there's not going to be a big project that we can take a swing at. This just really reinforces that in terms of we're no longer going to be able to consider kind of any projects outside of spending down the rest of the bond money. Now, the good news, this is what good news constitutes, is the fund balance is going to go down slow enough that we're not going to be in any financial danger. So this is the graph that shows kind of how we've been funding our operation. For a number of years, this was not going anywhere in terms of fund balance. We were sub $10,000. And then the first general fund loan of $1.2 million was made so that we could start the work on the byway project, do those utility locates that Greg was talking about. And then once everything kind of firmed up and City Hall was moving and we had these projects moving forward, we sold the full faith and credit bonds. All of a sudden we went from $10,000 of fund balance to 4 million in a very short time. Obviously, we have the point of urban renewal is to actually do things. And so we've been doing things and spending that money down. When we did that full faith and credit bond, we did not originally we had talked to you all about paying back the general fund loan. We recommended against including that in the bond funding for two reasons. One is it was a source of revenue to the general fund. Two, it offered more flexibility to the urban renewal in the future because bond funds can be used to pay for economic development incentives. That has to become either out of a general fund loan, non-bond funds, or out of your tax increment revenues, your yearly revenues. So the good news is we didn't pay that back. And so we were anticipating to have at the end of this year about a $1.4 million balance. Once we spend the rest of the Halsey Street crossings and the 150, we'll have about $800,000 to $900,000 left on the general fund loan. That will get spent down over the next few years until the bonds roll off in 2028. So that's really the next point at which the Urban Renewal Agency can look at doing a big project. And I say that with a caveat of if we were to get a really large development that wanted to happen within Urban Renewal Agency boundaries, and they wanted to do an incentive, kind of like a byway scale project, what would happen is that we would kind of, you can see kind of this revenue bump from the byways. We went from under 400,000 to over 600,000. It's a pretty big jump. If something like that came through the pipeline, I don't want you guys to get the impression that Urban Renewal couldn't be a player. What that would necessitate is probably doing a refinancing of the bonds and kind of taking out the next tranche of money for projects. So we'd refinance whatever the balance was left on the 2020 bonds and issue some more debt and kind of do another bond issuance with the idea that this blue line of revenue is going to jump back up because of spurred on by the development that would be going on. And so I want to be clear about that is we're not saying we can't do anything. It's just that outside of a really big project, kind of byway scale project that would allow us to do some refinancing, we're kind of locked into this until 28, 29 of doing kind of projects around the edges. So that's in summary, we still have some money to spend on some projects. We don't really have any capacity over the next 3 to 4 years to tackle anything outside of a big move. With that, I'd take any questions, comments, concerns that you might have, direction.
And if there's no really need to do, do what you're mentioning, then I think we do kind of what Dirk was saying, just kind of like let it sunset for now. And then until something pops up, because there's no need. So,
Yeah.
So why?
Yeah, we knew what the big needs were and we rolled all those in the 2020 bonds. And that was kind of our first big pot of money and set of projects that the Urban Renewal Agency was going to be able to tackle.
Yeah, because I mean, besides one of the mobile home parks or the great, the Grand Ron project, those other parcels that are in the agency, they're probably going to stay that way until something else happens. Property here.
The Vista View one, that'll probably redevelop, I would like to think, in the next 5 years. And the point is, even if someone came in tomorrow and said, I want to build 50 units there, it probably won't be on the tax rolls for 3 years. And even, not saying that's a small project, that's, a 12, 14, $15 million total all-in project, not a $50 million project. So short of major redevelopment, which we don't even anticipate, it'll be more of a renaissance of the Urban Renewal Agency of days when it was starting out.
Yeah, it's either feast or famine.
Yes. Great big eyes and very small bellies.
You're on mute, Mayor.
Even if, you know, let's, something that Seth, you said it, there is still a way. And that would be to reissue bonds. Yeah, and so, the conversation, I think it makes sense to, move forward with our projects now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, and I think even though, you know, having a graph where your revenues are less than your total expenses, again, we've got the fund balance to pay it. So we're good. It's just once we wrap up our projects, we're enjoying the fruits of those labors for a while.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I do have one more question. and This is concerning, we've used the city as a company basically to handle the urban renewal district. Is that something that was it a good thing or was it a hassle? Or, I mean, like the byway project was so large and, you know, did it stress out? I mean, did it cause problems inside
Well,
the city? Okay.
Of that size
But
will.
Yeah, but I'm talking, because all the nuances involved in the financing. And then I guess there's some issues with the SDC miscalculation or something there. And
It's right to the heart.
I'm just thinking maybe on huge projects, maybe we don't have the level of expertise, or I may have it, but
The capacity isn't there.
it puts so much more on staff to do on top of everything
It's-
else.
You know, it's a delicate balance. You know, I'll use Byway, for example, then I'll use like the Grand Ron property as a
Right.
potential example. So Byway was definitely a stretch assignment, both in terms of handling it all, operate, you know, still having our other operations and things. That was, I think, a net positive overall. Was there heartache, heartburn, lessons learned? Yes, I think it made us stronger overall as an organization. Now, with the project, let's just say, from what we know from the Grand Ron's Entertainment Complex, it's probably worth hiring on a person or two as kind of a project manager, to handle, the permitting things and the liaison things, without knowing, what the project is, timelines, et cetera. It's hard to say, for example, but that is one where bringing someone else on to exclusively look at that and then liaison between us is probably a smarter approach. You get something like a Vista View, even a subdivision of size. Again, they're stretch assignments, but I think we may not always enjoy them in the midst of the chaos. We do come out, I think, stronger in the end for them. And, it's good for the team. They can look at the 18 months or 36 months and go, wow, we did that. So there are positives. Yes, there were some hard lessons learned and some frantic phone calls and got closer to God.
You have to realize too, large multifamily apartment complex hadn't been built in Wood Village for, 25, 30 years.
50 years.
50,
It
yeah.
was the 70s. So call it 40.
And is that Madrea when you're talking about as far as a large apartment complex?
I think that was either Madera or like Mountain View. It was mid to late 70s
Yeah.
is when the last multifamily apartment building went up of any kind of size.
Well, anyway, I think the staff did a great job, considering the learning curve involved in doing it. And we seemed like we came out okay.
No, and that's why it's like, it was a net
Gray hairs and
positive.
whatnot, but.
Nobody left, so that's a
Nobody,
positive.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, net
Yeah.
positive for an organization and certainly as a community, we're starting to see owner side tenant improvements on the commercial end of the byway. So I think then we'll start seeing some new restaurants probably this summertime pop up in there. So it's gaining traction. The building across the street, that'll be open hopefully May time with a really cool coffee shop, bakery, deli thing. So all been a net positive. And that's when people ask, what's it like being in city management? It's a glorious burden because you have the times where you're in the thick of it and then you look at the end of it and it's something remarkable.
Okay. Well, Mayor, you got any further questions, sir?
I certainly do not. You guys are all asking all the smart questions. I don't know anything else.
Okay, well, enjoy the weather.
Yeah, thank you, Stanley. I appreciate that.
Any further questions? Anything, anybody else? Well, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting.
So much for your time this night.
Thank you,
Bet.
Chair.
Thanks for the presentations.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, John.
Good night.
Good night.